come back from the break. Sorry for just vanishing before. And I see we have a lot of questions in the HackMD. And are both speakers back? I unfortunately do not. Yes, okay, great. Then maybe let's start. I think, Shahnawaz, you had some questions that you put in the HackMD. Do you want to say anything about those? The favorite open source projects, funding agencies, and places for support.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it's personally, I just wanted to know what others are looking at because I come more from Python and quantum simulations. So it's really great to see people linking different things. Yeah, it seems there's not so much support for open source, but if you actually look for it, you can find places which recognize and support open source software development.
Okay. Then I guess I'll just go through questions that are there that we have not gone through and alternate between both of you. So maybe we can start with you. There is one question. Well, it's a more open question. Does anyone have stories of company hiring developers of a project going wrong? Do you maybe have one yourself?
I mean, not so many details, but I know personally someone that was hired for code, but it didn't work out so well. We also have, instances where we had students mentored, like we mentored students, but that didn't go so well. Usually what happens is before the project, it seems that the person who is applying makes a lot of effort, but once they get in, the project itself becomes very difficult. So they come in without having enough background understanding of what they have to do. So there's like a mismatch, and that has happened. I know once or twice with a student and with also someone who had to work on the project. But I think that's a risk that's always there, right? If you hire, a postdoc, a PhD student, yeah, you have to take interviews to really discuss what's going on. So the thing that I found really helps is if this person is already a contributor to the project, then it's much easier to understand if these kind of things can be avoided. So that's, yeah, a solution, but it can always happen, of course.
Right, thank you. Kristoffer, do you maybe have a story of a company hiring developers of a project going wrong, since it's such an open question?
Going wrong. I have one going right, which is Julia Computing hiring me, but I don't have so many things about when it goes wrong, But I think when it comes to Julia Computing, it was very a success story when I worked on the PhD and I started contributing to Julia, and I did a lot of open source there, and then I saw they had a position open and I applied for it. So I think I would definitely not have gotten that without the open source work I had done earlier. So.
Well, this is great motivation for everyone here, I guess. Okay, we have a lot of questions for you from the audience. So let's start with the one that is marked here. What is your favorite feature or thing in the Julia language or toolbox?
Yeah, I wrote the answer there. So for me, it's to be able to benchmark really quickly and then profile it and then optimize the code and then do that sort of in a loop to find what parts of the code is slow. You fix that and you benchmark again, you find a new part which is slow and so on. And you can quite quickly get pretty fast code, and you can look at the generated code and you see, oh, here there's some problem, and you fix that and it gets a bit faster. And so I think that's my favorite thing.
Okay. Let's go back to Shahnawaz. There is a comment that open-minded supervisors are an important source for coding projects. any stories of how people bring this up with the supervisors? Do you have any hints there?
Yeah, so for example, for me, it was that I was there as a master's intern, and then I talked to another postdoc who was doing some research with QTip, and we kind of did the whole thing as the first comment says. I didn't write that, so do it and tell it later. So we kind of did the whole thing and then said, yeah, we developed this package along with the paper, and we want to put it in QTip. And then that paper went out and got 100 citations in 3 years. So I think for PIs, some metric, if you can show some metric, usually it's maybe citations. That's why I say citations, maybe it's the academic currency. We can show some metric like that, okay, there was this tool that was developed and open sourced, and they have a lot of citations, so people are using it to convince. Maybe that's one way. And the other way is, of course, do it and then tell later that, yeah, by the way, we also have this code that's ready to be open sourced.
Right, thank you. Kristoffer, what is Julia missing, which you wish it had or will have at some point?
Yes, so as I showed, you can write pretty high performance code in Julia, but I think it's a little bit too difficult at the moment to take that Julia code and incorporate into some other project. Like, let's say you're a company and you have some code in, like, say, C++ or something, and then you want to have a bit of Julia code in there. I think it should be easier to just be able to put Julia code into your other project. I think that's a little bit too hard right now. There are works in progress for it, but I think that's one thing where I think improvement would be very good.
Good to hear there's already work in progress then. Then back to QTip. Does your university use QTip as an example of great work that is happening? Is it visible to the higher up people?
Yes, it is visible. So many times, not my university, but Riken, where Franco Nori is, they have a yearly meeting where it's asked what are the latest developments with QTips and things like that. And there are people who notice it because you can see some tool like that being used everywhere, so people understand the importance of it. But probably it's not visible enough that someone will fund you for 5 years directly for QTip. Although I don't understand the full mechanisms for it. What happens is usually it gets bundled as part of bigger grants. And then you have like, okay, you can also hire one research engineer as part of this bigger project to work on QTip and things like that. And for the second question, featured on the university websites, I don't think so. Like, it's more that we kind of find out which universities are helping support and put it on our website, but the university is not featuring QTip on the website.
Okay, thank you. Back to Julia. Does it make sense to rewrite old, for example, Fortran code to have a Julia version?
So I would say in some cases, yes, in some cases, no. For example, if you just have, let's take BLAS as an example, when you do a matrix multiply in Julia, in the end, it's going to call BLAS, which is written partly in Fortran. And in that case, there's no real gain to rewrite it in Julia if that's the only thing you're concerned about is the performance, because Fortran will be probably fast enough in that case. But what Julia allows you to do, since it has a JIT compiler, is that you can write generic code that can accept a lot of different numeric types. So let's say you want to have the same code that can, work on integer, floats, and then more fancy things like big integer that has a lot of digits, or rational numbers, or maybe even user-defined numeric types. Then in those cases, it's useful to rewrite it in Julia. So it allows you to be a bit more generic than the static Fortran type of language.
Okay, thank you. back to QTip. What would be your first suggestions for someone who has recently developed software that can break new ground or push the frontiers of their research field, but does not have a community or user base outside their own group yet?
So I guess the question is, how would you start building the community, you mean? So I think one of the things would be like, first of all, you need to get noticed. And if you just have a GitHub code somewhere, however good it is, probably will not get noticed. Maybe writing a short paper about it and putting it on the archive or some of these places that accept like code as software. And then kind of, for me personally, I've seen, so every time I write a paper, I make a small package about it and basically explain everything in the paper again in Jupyter notebooks with the code to reproduce each and every figure. So when you have a paper like that, and if the paper attracts the researchers, then they look at the code, and if they can like just copy paste code and see the figures themselves and start tweaking it, it really gets the attention. So I would say writing a short paper about whatever groundbreaking code you've developed and having a lot of documentation that makes it easy to tweak the code. And this formula has kind of repeatedly worked for me. So with all the scientific papers that I've worked on, I made a small package, made like a documentation with everything that you need to reproduce all the figures in the paper. And then you see already just because of the number of citations and downloads and forks, you can see that people are noticing, playing around. And then some of them will trickle down to contributing back. So it has to be very organic, but yeah, that's how it is.
All right, thank you for the good tips. Then there's a lot more questions to Kristoffer now. And we got the go that we can use a bit more time on this if you want to. I guess question 5 you already answered. If there's anything you want to still say to that, go ahead.
No, it's just a question about, I put an exclamation mark in a function, and there's nothing magic about that. It's just the way in Julia, how a convention you use to say that an input argument is going to get mutated. So mutation is always a bit scary. So in Julia, there's a convention that, there's an exclamation mark here, this function is going to mutate something. So be aware of that, basically.
Okay. Then there's a question about the QTip class, how it is handled in Julia, if the data is converted to Julia's form.
Yeah, so some things like, let's say NumPy arrays and Julia arrays, they can be transferred back and forth between Julia and Python without having to do any copying. They're both going to point to the same place in memory. But some things are going to require copying. Here, when it comes to the classes in Python, you're basically going to get some object where you can call methods on it and you can retrieve fields just like you would in Python. And depending on what data you get back, it might require a conversion to go into Julia's format, or in some cases it does not require a copying and conversion in case you could share the underlying data between them.
Could I follow up quickly on this?
Yes, please.
Question. It was really interesting to see that you could take a Python package and just mix and match Julia with Python, because one of the things that QTip has is it gives these boilerplate functions, like you showed an example of a coherent state creation. And if you can, use the boilerplate machinery of QTip to set up the problems and then use Julia for something super fast that Julia is good at, it's really interesting. But then it just seems like magic to me how does Julia create kind of a wrapper around the custom objects in Python, or like what would be the kind of overhead to?
You would basically get a pointer to the Python class, and then if you call a method there, it will basically go that pointer and call the method. I mean, it's kind of the same how the Python REPL would work. When you write something in the Python REPL, it's going to go into the Python runtime and call something there. Julia basically does the same thing. So the magic that happens is in the when you have this native Julia array and native NumPy array, how those get transferred between each other. So I'm not an expert on PyCall, but it works pretty well. You see, you can do plotting and stuff like that. So you can do pretty advanced stuff. So I think being able to do like use things that are written in Python really nicely, and then maybe you have some kind of really fast thing you need to use, and then being able to, you know, combine Julia and Python like that, I think is a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, Shahnawaz, there's a new question that came up. Do you publish those packages as standalone papers, or are they commonly part of a bigger publication?
So I publish them as standalone papers. So it's more like we have the paper and then we have a reference in the paper that the full code for this, all the results in this paper can be found in GitHub / you know, let's say it's a tomography paper. So like tomography method, some name. So then you can go into this, and the main focus of this paper is more to have all the Jupyter notebooks or maybe examples so that you can reproduce the code. So maybe the package itself doesn't make so much sense because it doesn't solve a bigger problem, like not as generic as NumPy. But then if you pack it up nicely, it just becomes easy for the user to just do like, you know, a pip install tomography with something. And then when you want to run it, it's like from tomography import this specific function, or from tomography import generate data. So the package is not necessarily, it's not necessary to make it into a package, but we make it into a standalone package so that people who are familiar with, you know, standalone packages can just run these examples.
All right, thank you. Then back to Julia. You were already talking about these wrappers for other languages. Do you have something to add to that about efficiency?
Oh, I think I said there about sometimes you have the copy, sometimes you don't. It depends if you can share the underlying data.
Okay. Maybe if we,
for example, this was specifically about Python, but if you call into C, for example, then you have exactly, you don't have any overhead compared to C calling into C, for example. It's going to be, I can actually really quickly, let's see here, I had one slide about that could I share my screen? Or
sure.
Just really quickly. So I had this slide that I took away, but for example, here, if you C call into the clock function and we look at the native code for that, this is exactly what you would get. If you would call this from another C call, you would just have you would just move the pointer to the clock function into the register and you would just call it. So yeah.
Okay, there's a lot more questions. How about, do you have any of those following questions that you would like to still talk about right now? Because otherwise I've seen that we also could move any bigger discussions to later to the unconference session. If there's anything that takes longer still to discuss about this. There seemed to be a lot of interest in it, so if you're up for it, and then that is definitely an option. But if there's anything you want to add now, then now is the time for it.
I can just do a very short example. When there was a question about overhead when you use this unitful package. So I'm just gonna quickly share my screen and go to my REPL here. So where did I put it? So here, if I do like 1 meter plus 1 meter and we look at the generated code, basically just gonna do load the data and add it. And if we look at the native code, it basically does just the add assembly instructions. So there's no overhead really to using units here because Julia will figure out that you know, it can just plus the ones here and the meter will just hang along. So I don't need to do any computation with the meters. So yeah.
Okay, then I would say we go on now with the program, and for everyone interested, if you both still have time later, we can do the breakout room number 1 for further questions about the topics or further demos if you want to. Maybe Richard can later also still mention something about this. Thank you both for coming and joining us and telling about your interesting projects.